Hello and thank you for joining us. My name is Ben Sheen, I'm Managing Editor here at Stratfor, and today I'm joined by Reggie Thompson, Latin American Analyst, and we'll be talking a little bit about the ongoing developments with Cuba and what the future holds for the country. So Reggie, we have the Summit of the Americas starting from April 10th, and it's the first time that Cuba will be in attendance in some time. What do you think they hope to gain by going to the summit?
Well, going to the summit will bring them in close proximity to Secretary of State John Kerry and President Barack Obama. And so there will undoubtedly be discussions between the top Cuban leadership that is attending, including President Raul Castro and these U.S. officials. However, this is being done in the context of ongoing negotiations between the United States and Cuba that have lasted since late December publicly, although negotiations in private had been going on for nearly a year and a half before that.
And clearly the main press conferences that are held will be widely televised, but it'll be interesting to see what happens behind closed doors and those kind of tacit agreements. So we're expecting to see a little bit of give and take between the United States and Cuba. Obviously, the US is looking at lifting the embargoes against the country, but what can the US expect in return from Cuba?
Yeah, so lifting the embargo against Cuba that has been in place for decades is likely going to be a long-term process, and there's going to have to be some give and take from the Cubans and from the United States. So right now in December and January, we saw the United States give on some issues such as the Cuban assets control regulations. Some of those were loosened to allow more remittances to flow into Cuba, to allow more American citizens to travel to Cuba. Just generally things like that. From the Cuban end, though, there's probably going to have to be some political liberalization that's going to happen in the coming months and years if this is going to be a successful negotiation. It's not fully apparent yet what method the United States and Cuba are going to choose to normalize relations from an economic and from a political level. So what could potentially happen is that the law would have to be changed, that is to say U.S. law, namely the Helms-Burton Act, which mandates human rights improvements for any lifting of the embargo to take place. Now, for the Cubans, though, they're on a different timeline. The U.S. has been pretty open towards liberalizing relations with Cuba, towards normalizing the political and the economic ties. From the Cuban end, though, they're managing a transition, a political and an economic transition. So, for example, what's going on with Cuba right now is that by 2018, we should expect President Raul Castro to step down. This is what he has said. His term will end in 2018, and he will pass on power to a successor, most likely right now, first vice president of the Cuban Communist Party, Miguel Díaz-Canel. Now, Díaz-Canel should be understood in the context of being a successor to Castro, and he is not a military official by trade, as many of the Cuban leadership are right now. So he's kind of a different figure from the rest of the Cuban leadership, and he will be at the head of any transition that comes in the coming years.
So with the transitions of power we're expecting both in the US presidency and for Cuba in 2018, are we expected the ongoing softening of relations to continue unaffected by these, or is there any way that decisions in the US Senate or actually back in Cuba could affect the deal negatively in any way?
So the Cuban rapprochement with the United States has always been very intimately tied into U.S. domestic politics. So in previous decades, it was that the very strong Cuban-American lobby, for example, and the electoral force that they represented in domestic politics pretty much held up any normalization of ties, and there wasn't really any interest from presidents to pursue that kind of diplomatic avenue of negotiations. This has changed now as the importance of the Cuban American lobby has waned, but what we're still seeing is that it's very highly dependent. Any resumption of political ties is highly dependent on whether Congress can really move towards approving any kind of lifting of the Helms-Burton Act or amending of the Helms-Burton Act. There's a lot that the president can do from his end, such as amending the Cuban assets control regulations, which fall under the Department of the Treasury. So, I mean, there's a lot of movement that can occur on that. But some provisions of the Cuban assets control regulations, CACR for short, these provisions cannot be lifted without amending the Helms-Burton Act. And the Helms-Burton Act explicitly states that you have to see progress towards a transitional government, and you have to see this transitional government has to have like a free and fair judiciary. It has to have free and fair elections, just generally things that the Cubans don't have right now. And it's political change that could potentially threaten the Castro government if it's carried out in a very short time frame. In other words, Fidel Castro remained in power by keeping a tight grip on Cuban opposition forces that could potentially threaten his government, as did Raul Castro. And so we're not really likely to see this shift in the short term. So what's probably going to happen is there's going to be slight negotiations between the United States and Cuba towards slowly liberalizing the political system, maybe allowing some political opponents to participate in some aspects of politics. But it's definitely very much a difficult negotiation.
And clearly we'll be watching the Summit of the Americas closely for any statements from either camp indicating the way that negotiations are moving forward. Reggie, thank you so much for explaining this today. For more on this subject and many others, please read stratfor.com.